They called it the greatest city on earth, and the man who said it wasn't some court poet trying to flatter a king, he was Ibn Khaldun, one of the greatest historians who ever lived, a man who had crossed the Islamic world, a man who had seen empires rise, collapse, and disappear with his own eyes. But when he entered Cairo in 1382, he stopped. And he wrote that Cairo was the metropolis of the world, the orchard of the universe, the hive of nations. But here's what Ibn Khaldun didn't write about: the children vanishing from the alleys, the bodies drifting down the Nile faster than anyone could count them, and the men tunneling through bedroom walls in the dead of night. Men who followed one simple rule: if you woke up. This is not the Cairo of postcards, minarets, and golden age nostalgia. This is the city beneath the legend. And by the end of this video, you'll understand something most history books never show you: that the magnificence and the misery of medieval Cairo were not opposites. They were built into the same system. Let us start with something almost nobody talks about when they praise medieval Cairo. This city, one of the largest in the medieval world, should not have existed at the scale it did. It sat beside the Nile, one of the greatest rivers on earth, and yet getting water from that river into the homes of its people was one of the most difficult engineering challenges in the medieval world. The Nile flooded seasonally. The land around Cairo rose and dipped at uneven elevations. You couldn't simply dig a trench and expect the water to flow where you needed it. So the Mamluks, the military slave dynasty that ruled Egypt for centuries, built something extraordinary: a vast system of aqueducts, underground cisterns, stone wells, and water wheels that lifted Nile water nearly 280 feet uphill to the Citadel of Saladin, the military heart of the empire. Yusuf's well alone, carved deep into solid rock beneath the Citadel, was one of the greatest feats of medieval engineering anywhere on earth. And recent archaeological excavations near the Citadel have uncovered two massive stone walls and heavy water wheels still connected to the ancient Magra al-Oyun aqueduct, a system built with one clear purpose: to make sure the military elite never ran dry. But here's the catch: that same brilliant engineering meant almost nothing to the people living below. If you were wealthy in medieval Cairo, your home could have private underground cisterns, clean water delivered through conduits straight to your door. But if you were poor, and most people were, your life looked very different: a shared public basin, a mosque fountain, sometimes nothing at all. The ruling class did build public water dispensaries called sabils across the city. They called it charity, divine duty, a path to paradise. But for Cairo's lower classes, the daily reality was much harsher: water scarcity, contaminated runoff, and long walks to crowded distribution point in neighborhoods growing faster than any infrastructure could handle. The city that engineered water to flow uphill for its rulers often let it run out entirely for everyone else. And that water problem was not just uncomfortable, it was deadly. Because in the year 1200, the Nile did not rise high enough. It stopped at 12 cubits, 4 short of what Cairo's agriculture needed to survive. And what happened next was recorded by a man named Abd al-Latif al-Baghdadi, a physician, a scholar, a man trained under Saladin's own court. He wrote about the disaster with cold, devastating precision. The river water turned green, thick, foul-smelling, like rotten vegetables. Citizens boiled it, but even boiled, it still tasted like death. Contaminated water spread disease through every neighborhood that depended on shared basins and public wells. And then thousands of starving villagers poured into Cairo from the countryside. Their crops were gone, their animals were dead, and the city's grain reserves, meant to feed a metropolis of hundreds of thousands, collapsed within weeks. Al-Baghdadi watched Cairo unravel in real time. First, the poor ate rotten carrion, then animal droppings, then corpses found in the streets, and then the children began disappearing from the alleys. He documented everything. Children abducted, killed, and cooked. A woman dragged through a crowded market after being caught eating a child. A mother on a canal bank shielding her infant while a man tried to snatch it, saved only when a passing horseman intervened. But here's the detail that should stop you completely. By midwinter, al-Baghdadi reported that human flesh was no longer only an act of desperation. It had become a preference. Citizens were storing roasted meat in baskets, saving it, like groceries. When authorities publicly burned a convicted cannibal as punishment, the half-roasted corpse was found the next morning partially eaten, because as al-Baghdadi noted, it was already cooked and therefore convenient. Daily deaths reached between 100 and 500. Bodies piled in the streets. Many were thrown into the Nile. Entire villages outside the city were found completely empty. Doors open, furniture untouched, every resident dead inside. And through all of this, the class divide never disappeared. While the poor died in mass graves, wealthy grain merchants and speculators built fortunes. The famine did not touch everyone equally. It never does. But this was only one crisis, one year, one collapse, because another catastrophe was coming, one that would make the famine of 1200 look like a warning. September 1348. The plague arrived in Cairo. By then, Cairo was the largest city in the Mediterranean world, bigger than any city in Europe, bigger than Constantinople. And when the plague, which had entered Egypt through Alexandria months earlier, reached the capital, it hit with terrifying force. The symptoms were fast and brutal: sudden extreme fever, severe nausea, respiratory collapse, and then the buboes, huge agonizing swellings appearing in the groin, armpits, and neck. The scholar al-Makrizi documented the case of a bathhouse worker who touched an active bubo on a corpse she was washing. She caught the disease almost immediately. Within days, she was dead. The neurological pain was so intense that some victims beat their heads against the ground until they died. Most were dead within 3 to 5 days of showing symptoms. At the height of the epidemic, Cairo was recording 20,000 deaths per day. And this is where everything changes. The Mamluk Sultan abandoned the city entirely, taking his court and fleeing to his estate outside Cairo for 3 months. And the government's official response? Nothing. Islamic jurisprudence at the time held that plague was divine mercy, that a devout Muslim who died from it died as a martyr. So the Mamluk authorities imposed no quarantine, no isolation, no travel restrictions. When the Andalusian scholar Ibn al-Khatib argued that the disease was contagious and could be stopped through isolation, he was condemned for heresy. So the plague did not simply pass through Cairo, it stayed. Between 1347 and the end of Mamluk rule in 1517, a span of 170 years, Egypt experienced 73 distinct plague outbreaks. That is one epidemic every 2.3 years on average. Entire residential quarters of Cairo were permanently abandoned. The constant loss of agricultural labor caused the Nile's irrigation networks to collapse from neglect, and the city that had once been the economic engine of the Mediterranean world began a long, slow structural decline. But even through famine, plague, and death, Cairo had another danger moving through its streets at night: the gangs. And most people misunderstand this completely. Cairo's criminal underworld was not random street crime. It was organized, territorial, and in many cases more powerful than the government that was supposed to stop it. The most feared were the wall tunnelers. Medieval Cairo's homes were often built with soft, porous masonry, easy to dig through if you had the right tools. And these men had the tools: crowbars, iron spikes, lock breakers, and a specialized instrument described as an iron hand with iron fingers. They tunneled directly through residential walls while families slept inside. And if a homeowner woke up during the robbery, their rule was simple: kill them immediately. No witnesses, no alarms. Then there was Al-Jamus, the water buffalo, a man so feared that his name became a proverb. He walked directly into citizens' homes and simply moved in, forcing families to surrender their property through physical terror alone. For years, the estate could not touch him. They finally got him when a soldier shot him with an arrow in a suburban orchard. But here's what most people get wrong about Cairo's crime problem. These gangs were not operating only in the shadows outside the system. By the late Mamluk period, criminal networks had formed open alliances with Mamluk military factions, religious scholars, and the neighborhood councils. Even the prefect of police frequently colluded with criminal groups when there was profit to be made. The underworld was not beneath the system. It was woven into it. And when the state finally decided to act, it did not choose justice. It chose a spectacle. The Mamluk sultans had a legitimacy problem that never went away. They were military slaves who had seized power by force. No royal bloodline, no hereditary mandate. In the first 50 years of Mamluk rule, 10 out of 13 sultans were deposed, 7 were murdered. So they compensated with public violence so extreme it could not be ignored. Common thieves were nailed to wooden frames on the sides of camels and paraded through Cairo's crowded markets for days. For political crimes, the punishments entered another category entirely. Captured rebels were impaled, flayed alive, roasted alive, buried alive. Whatever message needed to be sent, the punishment was designed to make sure no one missed it. And yet, even inside this theater of terror, something unexpected sometimes happened. In 1473, during a public execution at Cairo's famous Bab Zuwayla Gate, the youngest condemned brother, a boy named Salman, was brought forward. And suddenly the crowd began to shout. Not in anger, in pity. He was too young, they said, too handsome for this, and the Sultan listened. Salman was pardoned on the spot, saved from execution because the crowd responded to his face. Even in Cairo's most brutal theater, humanity sometimes broke through. Now, a step back from all of it: the famine, the plague, the gangs, the executions, and look at what was underneath. Beneath the Golden City was something far less glamorous. The sanitation system worked like this. Cesspools beneath homes slowly absorbed liquid waste into the soil. Men called Sarabatia, night soilmen, manually shoveled the accumulated solid waste into buckets and carried it through the city to massive rubbish mounds on Cairo's outskirts. These mounds grew for centuries. They absorbed demolition rubble, animal carcasses, industrial waste, even the ash of Fustat, Cairo's ancestral settlement, which had been deliberately burned to the ground in 1168 to prevent Crusader capture, and then people built upon them. Over time, the mounds became towering artificial hills surrounding the entire city, and the poorest residents of Cairo lived in their shadow. They worked beside tanneries, slaughterhouses, and gunpowder factories. They harvested decomposing human waste to sell as fertilizer. They collected animal dung from market streets and compressed it into dry fuel cakes, sold to families too poor to afford wood. This is where Cairo's most marginalized people existed, not inside the golden city of minarets and markets, but on the toxic, stinking edge of it. And this is what all of it reveals. Medieval Cairo was genuinely magnificent. The minarets were real. The scholarship was real. The markets that made Ibn Khaldun stop in awe were real. The engineering that lifted water 280 feet uphill to the Citadel was real. But the magnificence and the misery were not opposites. They were part of the same structure. The spectacular executions were not signs of a confident state. They were a military regime performing power because it was never certain it truly had it. The criminal guilds and informal water networks existed because the government had failed at its most basic functions. And the rubbish mounds surrounding Cairo were not just dump sites. They were the physical and economic foundation beneath the city's golden age, maintained by people whose names history never recorded. Ibn Khaldun called Cairo the orchard of the universe. He wasn't wrong. He just didn't tell you who was buried in the orchard. If this is the kind of history they never taught you, the history beneath the monuments, behind the golden age, and below the official story, then subscribe, because there is still so much more buried.